Hey everyone, Phobos here coming out with another discussion video, and this time it's going to be about boss health, and specifically we're going to be talking about the boss health change going from Live 2.6 to the Beta 3.0, and in case you haven't been following recently, basically it seems that all boss health on the Beta realm has been doubled from the Live realm, and we're pretty sure this goes all the way from the starter bosses as you go up through the acts, all the way to the map bosses, and then even things like Guardians and the Shaper and Uber Zeri and all that. So the highest like confirmed evidence, I guess you could say that I have, quote unquote, of this is data mined boss HPs that I found in some Reddit threads that I think it was for Core Malachi and Shrine Piety. So it seems like the changes at least go up that far. And since I never really considered those bosses like needing changes in HP, I guess it wouldn't really surprise me if it's going to be applied to the Guardians and Shaper as well. So we'll have to see when we get there. I'm going to probably be testing that out in more detail in the next beta patch after the reset. I didn't want to do too much work aside from checking out the progression in this current beta patch because a lot of things weren't released yet, like the ascendancy points and stuff. But we'll probably have all of that because we'll have Act 8, and I'll be checking that out. So if anything changes, I'll just update the video or just update the description part, and I'll probably make another video about this. But for now, I think it's safe to assume that that stuff's happening. So obviously, this has caused a lot of discussion within the community as to whether this is a good change or a bad change. My initial reaction is that this is a bad change and it'll be bad for the game. But before I go into my reasoning, I just want to say that remember, we are still in beta and a lot of things can change. And sometimes I would say changes like this can just be implemented to kind of get a ballpark for things. Like one of my theories about this change is that so they probably felt that even without the double dipping stuff that they're getting rid of, that maybe some of the bosses die a little bit too quickly, and they want that more difficult epic boss fight feeling, right? A little bit more of that. But they're also adding in a bunch of sort of new buffs in the sense of they're buffing some of the ascendancies and they're changing some of the unique items and they're adding new support gems. So there's a lot of potential or pathways for potential pathways for a new power, right? And so they maybe figure that if we keep the boss's HP exactly the same, they're still going to get crushed a little bit too easy. So what they're going to do is they're going to just double the boss HP at the start of the beta and kind of just go from there and see how players do against the bosses. So that's kind of my running theory behind this change, especially since it's such a broad brush change, because if I were to increase the boss HP, like I could understand arguments for that, but increasing all the boss's HP by just doubling it just seems a little bit weird because some bosses probably need more of a buff than others, right? So I think they're kind of just messing around with just seeing how it feels if everything has a lot more HP. And a lot of stuff can still change because we still have 4 weeks to go of beta, so that's the little disclaimer. And so one more thing actually is that even in spite of the fact that I don't think this will be a permanent change, I think it's still good to discuss it like it will be a permanent change because this is an argument I see on Reddit happen all the time where people will be like, oh, well, it's still beta, so it's kind of worthless giving this criticism, right? Like you shouldn't criticize it because it's the beta, but it's like, no, they want the criticism, right? Because they want to see how players are reacting to these changes. So in my view, it's best to take it as like, okay, this is what's going to be going live, and that way you can say, well, hey, if this goes live, I think it's going to have these specific repercussions. You know what I mean? So I never think it's bad to criticize something in its current state. And I think that's pretty much the end of the disclaimer. So moving on to the why I think it's bad. Start. This is what's wrong with the bosses in the first place, and this is going to be taking into account a couple of things, right? So it's going to be taking into account the 3.0 damage nerf, the 3.0 survivability nerf, and it's going to be taking into account what I would say are some of the biases that players have when they're encountering these bosses now, which is basically their gear level is probably a bit too high. In a lot of the cases, they're remembering fighting these bosses, and I'm going to try and remind people of how the bosses still can be pretty dangerous when you're first encountering them on new characters. So the first change is the first point I wanted to make is off your damage values being lowered, right? So obviously double dipping is going to be gone, and this is going to pretty much crush a ton of the current tier 1 builds. Now they might still be tier 1 for other reasons, but the damage values are going to be completely different because before it was like some of these builds where if you're making a tier list, if this is like League of Legends or something, it'd be like one character could solo kill your entire team because that's how much the gap between damage was between something like the animate weapon build, right? And like I don't know, some generic shockwave totem build, right? You're never gonna do the damage that this like crazy poison animate weapon is doing. That's just like carrying tons of people through breaches and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, the damage disparity is just huge, and a lot of that is going to be missing. So we're not going to have the insane damage anymore, but the HP is just getting buffed across the board, which again, which feels kind of weird because we're going to be losing so much damage. And the point I'm trying to make here basically is that part of the reason why I think some of these bosses at least sort of feel somewhat balanced to me, or on the cusp, or are on the cusp of being balanced, is because their HP is they don't have a huge chunk of HP actually. Because if they did have a huge chunk of HP, well, the bosses actually do quite a bit of damage in some cases, especially with certain map mods on them and stuff like that. So if you just buff their damage and the fight, I mean, if you buff their HP and the fight goes on forever, then these bosses just have tons more opportunities to one-shot you, right? Whereas now you kind of go into the boss room and you know, okay, like I need to pay attention for like 15 to 20 seconds. I need to dodge this projectile the boss throws out, or I need to like watch out for this attack, and I'll attack the boss at this point. And you kind of develop a formula in your mind, and it makes it feel like the boss is easy because you're so prepared for the boss. Um, but if the fight goes longer, things become more chaotic. There's more opportunities to essentially be one shot by the boss or be badly damaged by the boss and finished off by some other mob in the arena. So I think that with the boss damage being as high as it is now, um, the opportunity, like, you don't think you're going to die a lot more. I have the feeling that people think that the fight's just going to be longer. But some of these bosses really are quite scary. I remember in this 1 week that is just transpired, I was watching Ziz, and Ziz, we all know, is a super experienced player, multiple level 100 characters, plays the game a ton, always high in the ladder. You know, a lot of people are probably going to shit on him because he dies before he gets the first League 100, but there can only be one first League 100. So everybody who isn't that player isn't automatically shit. Little slight rant there, but yeah, so he was commenting on, I think it was the Acid Lakes boss. I think it's the Archer one that splits. And he was sketched out doing this on his Valsparker because at the time he didn't really have that much ES, and he was pushing really hard. And in situations like this, the bosses can definitely be dangerous. Like, it wasn't really hyperbole for him to be scared, because if he doesn't kill the boss quick enough and it gets enough copies of itself, and he gets hit multiple times, and he's ES, so he can be stunned, and he probably didn't have the Katavis Flask or whatever at the moment, the stun immunity one, and he probably didn't have stun immunity any other way. So these initial bosses do function as, you know, it's not as if he just went into the boss room and thought he could face roll stuff like this, right? And I feel like this happens with a lot of the bosses in the game, actually. You do have to be somewhat careful in how you approach them. The thing is, a lot of these players have so much experience that they know how to approach them properly, and they don't die a majority of the time, but there's still the possibility for death to occur, right? So I have an issue with this argument of that the bosses are just so weak and neutered that they could never kill you, right? And I think that if you do double the HP and this does go live like this, you know, it's going to be, a lot of these bosses are going to be a lot harder than people anticipate, let me put it that way. Because they're going to be doing a substantial amount of damage and survive for a lot longer. And this kind of leads me into the second point, where you are not going to have as much life, because ES is getting drastically nerfed by, like, it seems, a huge amount. It doesn't even look like we're going to be able to have traditional attack-based ES builds anymore with the Vol pack changes and stuff, where you can leech back to full. So it looks like ES is going to be more reserved towards stuff like summoners or totem builds. And life has gotten buffed a little bit, but it's certainly not by any substantial amount whatsoever that you'd really feel or notice, I feel like. So it's not as if you're getting life numbers or ES numbers that are actually life this time around. You know what I mean? You're pretty much staying on the old life values as far as we know, and you still have to fight these bosses. So your survivability has gone way down, and the bosses are taking a lot longer to kill and still doing a lot of damage. So those are two things to keep in mind. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up is the bias you have when you're doing the bosses, right? Because most people, I feel like this is how I play the game, right? I'll play a meta character at the start of the league, and I will grind probably to level 95 hardcore or whatever, and I'll make a ton of currency along the way, and then I just play stuff that's fun after that for me, right? Um, and a lot of people probably do something fairly similar. Maybe they have like a farming build that they know really well, and they clear the content and they make a bunch of currency. So first of all, like you're doing these bosses on a build you're very comfortable with, right? And on top of that, the build you're picking at the start is specifically made not to die to these bosses, which is why you're starting with it, right? You're picking a build that's going to be an easy start for you to overcome these bosses. And then you overcome the bosses, and you get a bunch of your loot and your gear and stuff like that, and then you start making alt characters. And when you run through on the alts, they're probably twinked out a bit because you have a ton of currency by that point. So you know you're gonna buy them like a gold rims. Even something like gold rims makes huge difference, right? Because so much resist you're getting. It's so efficient for one item slot. Or maybe you're getting dual life sprigs or something like that. And even when you're entering the maps, you're upgrading items, right? Now you can buy a pretty good item that gives you a ton of resist and health for like a chaos or two. Whereas at the start of the league, you probably couldn't even buy that item if you're pushing really hard in the first 8 to 12 hours or something like that. So yeah, your second run through, in a lot of cases, you're going to be much more well geared, and therefore it's distorting your view of how you're fighting these bosses, right? Because you're going to be fighting them more when you're geared because you only fight them once when you're under geared, really, and every other subsequent character is basically you're going to have at least some currency in the bank, generally speaking, when you're releveling the character. So yeah, your view of what is a difficult boss can be very skewed by that because you are basically just playing with more resistances, more life, and most likely more damage. So those are three problems that I see with like just assuming that the current bosses are, weak little things that'll just get walked over all the time. Those are like three little problems that I want to point out. And then another thing I want to talk about was kind of just generally speaking this idea of balancing for the hardcore, like for the top tier player, right? And because I think that while top tier builds, it does feel like you can crush a lot of these bosses without very much gear requirements. You really do have to keep in mind that GGG probably should be balancing for the middle of the road build, or even like the maybe slightly weaker than normal build, because not only are a lot of players like to play the game their own way. Not everybody is so inclined to look up a guide from somebody else and to tell them how to play the game. So you're going to have a lot of what would be considered suboptimal builds playing the game, and that's going to be a lot of your people, your overall customer base, probably. And then you have even people like me, like I respect the meta, and well, it sounds like a silly way to phrase it, but basically, like I understand meta builds and I like doing well in the game to some extent, so I will start playing meta builds, but then I will play eventually I'll branch off and just do things that I kind of like and find interesting with the game. So I will eventually be playing builds that like aren't top tier, aren't really that good or stuff like that objectively. And this is a playstyle that a lot of people like to partake in. And if you balance the game around very like really how would you say like well defined or well made builds, top tier builds, and then players that have like shoddy builds or mediocre builds come, they're in some cases going to be unable to do the content. I feel like this is sort of what happened with Guardians, because Guardians are the new benchmark. I almost feel like in Path of Exile they have been since they've been released, in the sense that it's like, is your build Guardian viable, right? It's kind of like the Uber Theory thing: is your build Uber viable? Because the jump in difficulty of the content is just so huge that only certain builds can really effectively take down these encounters. And I think it's fine to have encounters like that in the game, for sure. But now we're talking about moving away from just some of the encounters that have already very good rewards attached to them, and we're moving that difficulty onto normal bosses that are going to have, if at least if we keep the system the same, they're going to have very mediocre rewards at best, I would say, right? And it's kind of like an analogy that I'd make to WoW, where like I've raided in some really top tier WoW guilds, and I've also raided in some mediocre WoW guilds. And with every patch, where there's a content patch, everybody's always like, "Oh, it's such a shame that Blizzard makes these raids that the top guilds just delete in like under 2 weeks or something like that, or sometimes even under a week, and they should really make like hard encounters, and this game is so easy nowadays." And that's what I feel like is sort of happening here. People are making the argument that it's like, oh, Path has gotten so easy and all this, but they just don't take into account like so many things. And one of the things that they don't take into account like is that in WoW, for example, is that the people are putting so much time into this game, right? Not just in the instance, but outside the instance, through preparing their characters through gear and getting consumables for their character, that if it takes a method 2 weeks to kill a boss that's really difficult, then it's going to take you an insane amount of time. And if it takes method 4 weeks to kill a boss, just imagine it taking double that insane amount of time for you, right? There's definitely something to be said about people wanting to be challenged when they play games, but I feel like ultimately they also want to have fun. So there's definitely like a bit of a balance you have to hit there, right? Whereas if you don't want everything to fall over, but if you make things too difficult, people are not going to want to play. And I feel like a lot of people have that perspective right now where they're either the ones coming up with the strong builds, right? Or they're playing somebody else's strong build and they're rolling through the content, and they have no experience of playing the game from a build that's like mediocre or kind of like lower down on the tier list. And if you make these like some of those builds, like I've played builds like that because I'm interested in trying a bunch of different things, and sometimes things don't go as well as you plan, right? And you end up with a fairly mediocre build when it comes down to testing. With Path of Building, obviously, you can do a lot more with the theory crafting now, but back in the day, it was kind of more of a pain in the ass. So you end up with these mediocre builds, and they don't necessarily struggle super hard with all of those low tier bosses. But if you double the boss's HP, it can make killing those bosses a bit of a nightmare. I could already imagine something like that. So I think it's really important to keep that type of balance in mind. And it's like, again, it's something that's not just going to affect the casual player, because some of even the hardcore players or the players like to play a lot like to experiment with suboptimal things. So it's just something that they really have to keep in mind, because if you cater to the top tier builds every time, you're just going to run into people not being able to get past, like, I don't know, like a tier 6 boss, and they're going to just get mad and quit the game, right? So something to keep in mind there. And now I think it's time to move on to the possible suggestions, right? So if this is the case and the people in GGG does want to just give that longer, more epic feeling encounter, I do have a couple, I think, better ways they could implement it. The first is maybe make the boss more powerful for the initial kill, right? So one of the ways you can do that easily is obviously you could just have it so the boss is stronger on the initial kill, but I feel like that feels sort of arbitrary. So maybe the boss has like the double health and a bit more damage when you first kill him, and then after that he gets easier, so the game doesn't feel like a complete grind where you just have to keep killing this super annoying hard boss over and over and over again, right? But to kill it for the map credit, you need to kill it in its hard mode or whatever. But that just seems, like I said, a little bit too arbitrary. So what you could maybe do is something like the maps that are behind the boss, basically. So like the maps that are above the boss, give the boss the maps that are above the map that has the boss you're doing in, right? Give the boss different affixes or a certain strength, right, for every like map that you haven't completed. And then what that'll do is it'll make it so like the first couple times you're killing these bosses, they have these extra affixes that makes them more dangerous. But then as you kill them and you get the higher tier maps to drop, when you go into that higher tier map and you kill that boss, then that affix won't be present on the prior boss anymore, right? So as you keep going up the map chain, and you unlock more and more maps, and you get the completion credit for more and more maps, um, the bosses essentially get weaker and weaker. And it would also kind of be interesting in the sense of how it might affect the shape map system, because you wouldn't really be taking out all the maps, right? And if you wanted to do a shape map type of atlas, so that means that some of the bosses will still be left with these powerful affixes. So that could be potentially interesting, and it would be a good solution where like you wouldn't have to kill the tough boss all the time, because you'll eventually get to a point where you remove the affixes if you want. That's kind of a little out there, but I think it's an interesting idea. It might be something worth checking out. But I think the more common one definitely is the better loot, right? And I see this all the time in the threads that I've been looking at, and they're basically like, well, it's fine if the bosses are stronger, I just want better loot. And people are like, yeah, it's all about the loot versus reward balance. And it's kind of made to seem as if like this is something that you can calibrate easily, and it's more just about like making a certain number of adjustments, and eventually you're gonna hit the correct adjustment, right? So it's like, oh, if we go too much in one direction, it's fine. We just rein it back in, continue to making adjustments until we get like the perfect one. But in my eyes, the reason why I don't like this method of just giving the boss better loot is because I don't think there really is a perfect risk versus reward in a lot of these cases, right? Because I think it becomes rather binary, is what happens, where if you make the loot too good, right, people are just gonna only make builds that can kill the boss to get the loot. And then if the loot isn't good enough, then they're just going to never kill the boss unless it has some other functional purpose. So like it basically like it's always gonna come down to a point where people are gonna decide, is the boss worth killing or not, right? And if the boss is worth killing and is capable of being killed in a consistent manner, then they're going to make a specific build to do that, or like whatever builds can kill that boss are going to be popular. And if that's not possible, then people are just not going to kill the boss. So I just don't understand like the better loot argument, right? Because I think it's best if you make it so that, like, let's say to make a really high incentive, you just say, okay, so every time you kill a boss of the map, it drops a +1 map, right? Then everybody is just going to be focused on boss killing, and a build is going to be deemed worthless if it can't kill uh, the boss, like the higher tier bosses, right? And if you go the other way, where you just double the HP like we have now, and you don't add any more loot, there's not going to be even any choice to killing some of these difficult bosses, in my opinion. It's going to be like, well, why would I want to kill something like Core Malachi if it's actually going to be really dangerous, right? Like, I'm just always going to skip it. It's not even going to be worth it. And then I can run a lot more dangerous mods because I don't have to fight the boss anyway, and I just have to fight the trash. So to me, it's just like it's way too easy to get into that binary mode where you're going to be picking one or the other all the time. And I actually think that where we are now, it's kind of much more interesting because the bosses aren't so hard where you feel like you have to avoid them all the time, and you can make decisions in terms of killing them. But if you give it that little extra push, then I feel like people are going to always avoid the bosses unless you add a counter incentive which is just too strong. Like I said, like the +1 maps. And in this case, if you do add that counter incentive and the bosses are super tough, then it's just gonna really stymie the build diversity because only so many builds are gonna be able to kill the boss. So that's pretty much uh, my thoughts on this. My thoughts and suggestions. Like I said, I just recap. Really not a fan of the whole mentality that we think we can just manipulate the uh, what is it, the risk reward until ad nauseum, because I don't think in reality that's a thing. It just starts to get binary at a certain point. And my other suggestion about the first kills could potentially be interesting, but ultimately, I think that it would be nice if they just left the bosses alone, maybe gave them a slight buff, or I think the smartest thing is to buff them on a per boss basis, right? Uh, so maybe they're just testing this out now, and hopefully, when it comes time to actually implement the live changes for 3.0, maybe they'll have figured out like which bosses they think really need the extra HP, and they will adjust that accordingly. But yeah, I think this global change to everything all at once is too much. I also, another thing is I don't like them changing so many variables at once. But it is still beta, so I understand why they're doing it now. But I think if things become really difficult, and we'll see that in the next probably week or two, because we're going to get Act 8 and have access to all the ascendancies and stuff, and people are going to be testing more. So if things do really feel super difficult, I think going into live with the change of your damage and survivability being super reduced and your boss health being doubled, I see that as very unwise, and like it's going to cause a lot of frustration and definitely stymie the diversity of the build. So yeah, we'll have to see, but that's pretty much my thoughts on it. So if you like the video, feel free to subscribe and give it a like. If you dislike it, feel free to dislike, leave some comments down below. I'm open to criticism, obviously. I'd love to hear what you guys think. So, yep, that's pretty much it, and I'll see you next time.